In a great kingdom, the king sat alone in his throne room, long after everyone had gone to sleep. He had ruled for many years, but on this night something inside him felt very heavy and very lost. He stood up slowly and walked to the palace door and slipped out into the dark streets alone. He had not walked alone in the village streets in so many years he had forgotten what it felt like. The streets were empty and dark and cold, and the moonlight made everything look like a painting. He walked without knowing where he was going and let his feet take him wherever they wanted. After a long time his body gave out and he leaned against a cold stone wall in a narrow street. He told himself he would rest for just a moment and then he would walk back to the palace. But exhaustion was stronger than his intention, and he slid down the wall and closed his eyes. And there in the cold, dark street, the most powerful man in the kingdom fell deeply asleep. Before the first light of dawn, a poor boy appeared at the end of the narrow street. He was carrying a bundle of firewood on his back that was almost as big as he was. He stopped when he saw the sleeping figure slumped against the stone wall ahead of him. He set his bundle down quietly and walked slowly toward the sleeping man to see if he was well. He crouched beside him and looked at his face and noticed the quality of the robe beneath the hood. He looked up and down the empty street and then looked back at the sleeping man in the cold. Without thinking about it very long, he took off his own thin, worn jacket and placed it over the man. Then he sat down beside the sleeping stranger and decided he would stay until the man woke up. He sat in the cold in his thin, torn shirt and watched the end of the street in the growing dawn. And the king slept on without knowing that a boy with nothing was keeping watch over him. The morning light grew slowly, and the village began to stir with the sounds of early risers. The poor boy sat quietly beside the sleeping man and did not move and did not leave. He looked at the man's face again in the growing light, and something about the strong features made him wonder. Then the king began to stir, and his eyes opened slowly to the pale morning sky above. He sat up and felt the thin, worn jacket on his shoulders and looked down at it with confusion. He turned and found the poor boy sitting quietly beside him, and they looked at each other. The king looked at the jacket and then at the boy's thin, torn shirt and understood immediately. He asked the boy quietly why he had given a stranger his only jacket in the cold. The boy shrugged and said simply, "You looked colder than me, and I was already awake anyway." The king stared at the boy after those words and did not speak for a long, quiet moment. Then the king slowly reached up and pulled his hood back from his face in the morning light. The boy looked at the revealed face carefully, and something in his expression shifted slowly. He looked from the face to the robe and back to the face, and recognition arrived all at once. The king watched the boy's face, and for the first time in a long while he felt something like peace. They sat together against the stone wall in the full morning light without either of them speaking. Then the king asked the boy his name and where he lived, and the boy answered simply and plainly. He told the king about waking before dawn every day to collect firewood before the market opened. He told him about the streets he walked and the people he knew and the life he lived without complaint. The king listened without interrupting and without looking away and without thinking about his throne, and he realized he had not truly listened to anyone speak like this in a very long time. The king looked down the street at the abandoned bundle of firewood and felt something shift inside him. He carefully removed the thin, worn jacket from his shoulders and handed it back to the boy. The boy took it and put it back on and looked at the king with simple, honest eyes. The king reached into his robe and removed a small, heavy golden medallion engraved with the royal crest. He held it out toward the poor boy, and the boy looked at it and slowly shook his head. The boy said, "I did not cover you, because I wanted something, and I do not want anything now." The king looked at the boy for a long moment, and then placed the medallion into the boy's hand. He closed the boy's fingers around it and said, "This is not payment, and it is not a reward. He said it is so that you remember that what you did this morning was worth more than you know." The boy looked at the medallion in his closed fist and did not fully understand, but he nodded. The king stood up slowly from the cold ground and looked down at the boy beside him. He said, I have sat on a throne for 20 years, and this street taught me more than my throne did. Then he turned and walked back up the road toward the palace in the golden morning light. The boy stood and watched him go until the figure disappeared around the bend in the road. He looked down at the golden medallion in his palm, and then up at the palace on the hill. He stood there for a long moment in the quiet morning trying to understand what had just happened. Then he picked up his bundle of firewood and put it on his back and continued down the street, because firewood still needed to be delivered, and the morning was not going to wait for anyone. But something was different now in the way he walked and the way he held his head. And the king who returned to his throne that morning was not quite the same king who had left it